I get a common question that comes from folks, whether they work inside of a healthcare organization or perhaps they work in a solution vendor. And so the common question is in connection to, how do I manage my provider data most efficiently? This question comes up when organizations are thinking about how they can reduce the time it takes in order to have a provider, what's known as onboarded. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm specifically mentioning the expression onboarding does not pertain to the activities that are associated with the upstream different teams that help get a provider in a condition so they can actually be able to provide patient care. When I use the expression onboarding, I simply mean the enablement of the data from those upstream systems in order to make that data available to provision access for the provider so that they can actually provide patient care. So for those of you that come from my same background as a medical staff service professional, when I use the expression onboarding, I definitely don't refer to the work efforts that we do in the space that we come from. Let's get started. Organizations these days are comprised of a number of different teams, and those teams are all responsible for various different work parts within their organization. When you're thinking about the fastest way to be able to have a provider who's coming to your organization to be able to provide patient care, whether that be as an employed relationship or as an independent medical staff professional, maybe associated with one of your acute care facilities, and or a referring provider, maybe someone from the community, lots of different pathways to enter into the organization per se. A lot of times organizations will think the process of managing that data is as simple as taking data from what's known as the medical staff office credentialing system and then making that data available in the EHR. It might be 2026, but people still think that that's actually a possibility. Let me point out to you why that's not a great idea. So, the medical staff office is predominantly responsible for looking at the clinical competency for the provider to make sure that they're actually able and should be performing certain types of privileges in an acute care setting. There are definitely some hybrid scenarios, which I'm not going to talk about today, such as CVOs and teams that have consolidated their actual efforts from an enterprise standpoint. But in general, the medical staff office is most certainly the source of truth in the healthcare setting for provider demographic information. By that, I mean the provider's name, their practicing degree, and other types of common attributes that are very slowly changing over time. When the provider is onboarding into the organization, the medical staff office has a process that they enable, which we'll talk about in a different video. But as the data becomes ready and it's technically available for use, that's when the time ticking begins. You want to then be able to move that data from the medical staff office as quickly as possible so that you can provision access to a myriad of downstream applications, including some of the most popular. This would be the EHR, badging systems in order to get the provider's ability to badge in, get into parking, get into the different buildings, to be able to purchase lunch. Mobile devices, monitoring, and by that, I mean the systems that you know that I know exist in your services in order to monitor certain kinds of behavior. Then there's third-party applications. We won't talk about all of those. Scheduling systems in order to identify which provider is available at various different locations. Surprisingly, that information is actually not typically contained in the EHR. Then you've got your internal directories. By the way, there's more than one type of directory. This is predominantly for the internal directory for clinical staff members so that they can find the providers who have certain kinds of privileges when they're trying to expedite patient care. Finally, the external directory. These are just some examples of the different kinds of downstream systems that need that provider demographic data. So here's where the complexity lies. When the clock starts ticking and the provider needs to be able to provide patient care, it's imperative that the data is able to move from certain upstream systems in the most expedited fashion. In our modern day and age, the process when the team who works on medical staff offices gets the signal through medical executive committee that it's okay to move forward, that's when data needs to flow in just a matter of minutes. So in our modern day and age, most healthcare organizations employ something known as the Identity Access Management process. The Identity Access Management, or IAM, enables the ability for select types of data elements to be able to move seamlessly and then to be able to map into different kinds of role templates so that the provider can have base level access into the different systems downstream. You can see where I've drawn out the Identity Access Management solution, its predominant responsibilities within the organization, how it's used for limited data elements, and how that information is then sent down to select applications in a timely manner. This is most commonly done via an API, but there's some organizations that still do this via batch. The problem with using the Identity Access Management for more data elements than are typically configured is you begin to have to offer additional services such as matching records. What kind of records would you have to match? Well, in order to actually properly build out a provider's record inside of the EHR, you need more than the data elements associated with who the provider is. You also need to know information that's contained from other sources. Inside of the healthcare systems, there's a process known as enrolling or enrollment in credentialing. That means that that particular team or application is responsible for managing data associated with the insurance payers. In other words, which payers is the organization contracted? Contracts are typically managed in a different application. Which of them are contracted? And for those that the organization has contracts with the payers, then there's a team responsible for then doing the enrollment process so that providers are able to accept insurance at certain locations. And so even though an organization might be able to provide insurance services at a particular organization, it's by location and then by provider, which means that you have to pull information about those different insurance plans that the provider is authorized to be able to accept for an application known as enrollment. From there, if a provider is also employed in some degree, or perhaps receiving compensation for various different services that they might provide as a medical director or other types of roles, then select data elements are actually being managed in what's known as an ERP or the HRIS or HR information. Together, these three applications contain information about that particular provider. And if the provider is employed, oftentimes there's a separate team responsible for also managing additional data elements associated with the provider's preference as to business cards, paint colors, and practice location information that they have as they're setting them up for the care that they'll be providing in an ambulatory or medical group setting. In addition to that, I mentioned contracts, but there's also data from the marketing teams. Marketing teams most commonly contain the data elements associated with the locations or the naming conventions for the different locations. And on top of that, you also have what's known as the on-call systems, and they manage the on-call information for the providers who are providing coverage during certain times. Collectively, this type of data would have to end up being matched, mastered, survivorship, and a number of other functions that are most commonly not managed or facilitated through what's known as the Identity Access Management solution. So what do modern healthcare organizations do in order to achieve all of these different processes in the most expedited process? They use what's known as master data management. And master data management pulls in all the different attributes from these sources. It performs a number of different capabilities, including matching records, profiling to make sure that the information coming in doesn't have any egregious errors. If there's issues that are found, they offer data stewardship or data governance workflows. They're also able to determine whether or not a particular attribute needs to come from a source that's known as the source of truth versus a different particular source. And I'm covering all of these details in an expedited fashion for the sake of the video and for those watching. Lots more details, and we're trying to keep it as high level as possible. But continuing on, then as this information comes in from all these different sources and those different capabilities are performed, as I mentioned, at that point, then you have what's known as the master record for that particular provider. And that data then can move seamlessly into sources such as the identity access management solution. And from there, not only can the EHR record be fully built out, but all of the other sources downstream can receive information about that provider in a very timely fashion. And that is how modern healthcare manages provider data.